I enlisted in the National Guard when I was still in high school, and that was in 1939, I believe. I had enlisted in the 260th Coast Artillery of the National Guard in Washington, D.C. And we were mobilized. I believe we had orders to be mobilized in late 1940 or early 1941, I forget which. And I was in college, and I went to the captain and told him he did not know whether that would make any difference or not. As it turned out, since I was still in college, they gave me the opportunity to resign, and so I was given an honorable discharge. Then after Pearl Harbor, I felt motivated and enlisted in the Navy in the V7 program, which was an officer candidate program. And I was first sent to Dartmouth College and then to Columbia University, where I was went through midshipman school, and I was commissioned in April 13th, 1944, and was given orders to the LST 982. I missed my ship, so I was put on another transport ship to transport me to Roseney, Scotland, transferred then to a British headquarters. They put me on the Flying Scotsman train and sent me south. My ship was at that time in Southampton, England. And that's finally when I caught up with it. By this time, we were now into late May when I finally reached the LST 982. The captain was surprised because they thought that since I had missed the ship, I had been transferred to another ship. In any event, I was then assigned as navigator on the LST 982. And just a couple of weeks after that, we were in operation, I guess it was the Overlord was the name of the Normandy campaign. And the naval portion of that was Operation Neptune. My ship was loaded up tanks and troops, and we loaded English and Canadian troops. A lot of people misunderstand Normandy was more than just an American operation. As a matter of fact, there were, I believe, as many British ships and British soldiers and sailors involved in that operation. In any event, we left. We were due to leave port on June 3rd, but a terrific storm came up, and the Operation Neptune was delayed a couple of days. We never left port. We were given new orders to depart the night of June 5th, and we rendezvoused out off the Isle of Wight in the English Channel with other amphibious ships, and we then set sail at night across the English Channel. We were part of a armada, I believe. There were over 4,000 naval vessels, including battleships, cruisers, and amphibious. I was on an LST 982, which was a landing ship tank. That's what those letters stand for. We had tanks and armored vehicles and personnel. We were ordered to beach at Juno Beach, which was right next door to Utah and Omaha Beach. We were supposed to hit the beach in the second wave, I believe around noon. Everything was a little delayed because the storm had washed out a lot of the buoys that were marking the sectors where the amphibious ships were to land. The LSTs and the smaller amphibious ships actually just drive right up onto the beach. It's a flat bottom boat. And you just drive until you actually are grounded. And if the beach is sloping gradually, the ship would open the bow doors and lower a ramp, and the tanks and the armored vehicles would go off. If the water was not too deep where we were, they would then proceed into the beach. As it turned out, some of the tanks got submerged and actually stalled out. Not on ours. Fortunately, our group landed at an area of the beach that was not so deep. So we discharged all of our armored vehicles and tanks and troops. They had the objective of capturing Caen, C-A-E-N, which was a city just inland from where we landed at Juno Beach. We unfortunately did snag a cable, which was one of the mining that the Germans had two types of mines. They had contact mines and they had what I believe were called sonar mines, which the sonar mines were buried in the bottom, and the propellers of a ship or boat would set off that mine. The mine that we snagged was connected to cables. We snagged a cable and the mine exploded, but fortunately it was far enough after the ship that there was no damage. We also were bombed by German Stuka bombers were bombing the craft. We again were lucky. One aerial bomb landed just astern, and I remember the stern of the ship came out of the water from the explosion, but again, no perceptible damage at that time. But from the beach, the Germans were in pillboxes that you probably have seen photographs of. These were cement emplacements that were largely below ground, but enough above ground so that the German cannons, which were called 88s, they were 88 millimeter. Again, we were fortunate. The pillbox closest to us was far enough away that there were other landing craft that the Germans were shooting at, and we were far enough away that we didn't get hit by those. The Germans also had machine guns in those pillboxes. We observed that it was difficult for the troops to knock the Germans out of those, because when they managed to get up close enough and throw in hand grenades and kill those gunners, there were other Germans that came up from below. It turns out those pillboxes were 2 or 3 stories deep. So it took a while to secure the beach. Unfortunately for us, we were traveling at too high a rate of speed when we beached the LST, and normally the tide would go out. You would discharge your load, as I mentioned, and then the tide would come back in and would float the ship, and we had a stern anchor that would help pull us off. As it turned out, we went over a part of the beach that hung us up, and we could not get off when the tide came in. That was not good because we were then a solitary sitting duck ship, and we were really exposed to bombardment and aerial bombardment if we couldn't get off. Fortunately, they found a tug. We were able to, by radio, get a tugboat that helped shake us loose and pull us off of the beach. That was very fortunate because we would have been just obvious target as solitary ship stuck on the beach. So that was the first of 20-some trips we took back and forth to support the invasion. One of the most interesting trips I can tell you about, it was a special mission where in August, I believe, we were still there, and if I'm not mistaken, I'm not sure whether it was Patton's Army, Third Army, I've forgotten which army it was, got cut off in the Brest Peninsula, and we were ordered to join a group of 3 ships, 3 LSTs, which loaded ammunition and gasoline to resupply the army that had been cut off. And that involved going around the Brest Peninsula to a very famous, what is now a very famous resort area. I believe it's called Mont Saint Michel, which is on the west coast of the Brest Peninsula, and we were the first Americans there. There were still, when we arrived, the 3 ships, and the ships also we had vehicles that were going to carry the ammunition and the gasoline to the troops. The French villagers came running out to the ships, greeting us. It was a very interesting ceremony, and warning us that there were still some Boche, they called the Germans Boche, were still in town, so to be careful. We unloaded our gasoline on that beach. Interestingly, that beach has some of the highest tides anywhere in the world. It's a very flat beach, and I believe when the tide goes out from the high water mark to the low water mark is several miles. It was that flat a beach. That was the most interesting special mission that we had. Our ship was ordered back to the States in December of '44, and then we had some repairs and some refitting. They changed our 40-millimeter guns on the bow and the stern from twin to quad millimeters, and they also added some 20 millimeter on the sides of the ship. And we were then ordered to the Pacific. We went to Norfolk, then through the Panama Canal, and to San Pedro, California. then to Pearl Harbor. And in Pearl Harbor, we got some additional vehicles, and we were then sent to Eniwetok, and then from Eniwetok to Saipan. And Saipan is where we loaded up our invasion load of troops and vehicles for the Okinawa campaign. I was a navigator. Actually, because of one mistake, the ship called me the fouled up navigator. The problem was when we were headed out of Norfolk to the Panama Canal, the heading we were given was to, as we approached Panama, to avoid mining that they had for the entrance to the Panama Canal. I know that we were headed on a course before going into Panama and were challenged to stop all engines and change course. And we had a small boat came out and boarded and said, may not realize that you're headed into a minefield. So we took him into the chart room and I said, look, here are the charts I was giving in Norfolk. He said, yes, but those charts are out of date. And the communication officer said, these are the signals I was given to confirm, and they said, your signals are out of date in your reply. So this was a matter of reservists not getting the correct. It wasn't truly our fault, as it turned out, but fortunately, we didn't go through the minefield. We are loaded up for the invasion of Okinawa. We were in a small convoy that had destroyer escorts that escorted us past the island of Ieshima, which is just off of Okinawa. Fortunately, the Okinawa beach was more secure than the Normandy situation. And that was because I believe the Marines that landed there earlier in Higgins boats, or LCVPs, which were landing craft, vehicle, and personnel. These were little boats that were open boats. They had secured that beach pretty well by the time we reached it. So it was a much more secure and not nearly as much fire as we experienced in Normandy. The only problems that the Marines talked about were the Japanese booby-trapped a lot of onshore trees. If there were objects that looked attractive, they booby-trapped those, so the troops trying to pick up something would be subject to booby trap, and these were explosive devices that they had. The Japanese were more devious in that regard. The Germans, interestingly, at Normandy, the Germans had big yellow signs for the minefields. And there was a sign that was in German, Achtung Minen, attention mines. That's quite a contrast, I think, to the Japanese, who, instead of alerting whoever was involved to mines and explosives, they booby-trapped. But at this point, the Japanese kamikaze planes were in operation, and again, we were lucky. There were larger ships that the kamikazes went after. There were destroyers and destroyer escorts, and again, while we saw kamikazes and we saw some of them hit and crash into ships. We were lucky. An LST was only 327 feet long, not a big object, although we did see one LST that was hit by a kamikaze. Again, we were fortunate. We pulled out of Buckner Bay, went out to Anchorage, and then we were going to be sent back to Saipan for reloading, and instead they sent us to the New Hebrides, to the island of Espiritu Santo, I believe it was, where we were to load up. At this point, I'm not sure that they were, again, British troops in preparation for the invasion of Japan. As it turned out, we loaded up and we went back then from Espiritu Santo. We went back to Saipan, and at that point I received orders, rotation orders, to report back to the States. I had been I've forgotten by this time whether it was 18 months rotation. I was to relieve the commanding officer, I believe, of another LST. So I was sent back to the U.S. I was attached to the Potomac River Naval Command temporarily. And then I was sent out to Seattle, where I was supposed to join this ship I was going to relieve a command. It so happened that en route I was sent out on a train. I picked up a bug, and I checked in. I guess that train actually took me to Los Angeles first, and I checked into what the Navy calls sick bay. That would be sort of the emergency room. And the doctor said, "My goodness, you have a terrible case of infected tonsils. We cannot send you back to sea. We're sending you to a hospital until that clears up." I was in the hospital in San Francisco. I forget the island they put me on where the naval hospital was. And I had a visitor while I was there from the Naval District, said, "You are ordered to a ship. What are you doing here?" And I gave them the my health jacket and said, "Doctor put me in a hospital." And they went to the doctor and got him to give me a discharge, if you can believe it. In the middle of the war, they discharged me from the hospital, then put me on a train to Seattle to join this ship. By the time I got there, that ship had left. The next thing I knew, they canceled those orders and ordered me to the AV-17, the Cumberland Sound, which was a seaplane tender. And I was assigned first lieutenant on that ship. Seaplane tender was a ship that had a little deck on the back where they serviced PBYs and PBMs. These were aerial surveillance planes that the Navy used during World War II. That ship was not going to service planes. We, at that point, became very secure. We had a detachment of Marines that came aboard, and the next thing I knew that we were going to be one of the command ships for the atomic tests at Bikini. And we had visits from General Groves, who came aboard and indicated they wanted to mount a lot of heavy equipment for, I believe, detonating the bomb and for recording the effects in terms of heat, radiation, and whatever. As it turned out, I was offered another half a stripe to stay on board for that mission, but I had enough points to get out if I wanted to. The Navy held me over for 90 days, at which point I did elect to go back and be discharged because I still had not completed my undergraduate degree. So I went back, got discharged, and I remained in the Naval Reserve with a unit in Washington, D.C., then in in San Francisco. I went to graduate school at Berkeley, University of California, and then I got an appointment to Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. By this time, I'm an academic. I'm no longer a naval personnel, although I remained in the Naval Reserve until I had 23 years of active duty and reserve duty. 1971, I got a call from the White House inquiring if I would accept an appointment to the U.S. Price Commission. President Nixon invoked the Economic Stabilization Act of 1970. At that time, we were experiencing very serious inflation. So he appointed a price commission, which was a group that controlled prices. I was on that for 2 years. I think the most memorable event, to my way of thinking, was when we hit the beach at Juno Beach. There was, as youngsters at that time, see, 1944, I was 23 years old, and I was up on the bridge with the captain at that time as navigator. There was a combination of adrenaline, excitement, fear. It was almost, I had the feeling that I was in a dream, and yet it was all very real.
A bit surreal.
But it was exciting, and there was a certain, I must say, a pleasure at being a witness at the time. It just was a very strange sensation. And I noticed the conversation on the bridge was, in retrospect, amusing, if not strange, where we would see an 88 hit something and someone would say, "Did you see that?" And someone would say, "Look at that." It was a very strange experience in retrospect. As I said, we sort of were in the middle of something, and yet, even though we were exposed, we were lucky that we were far enough from that one pillbox. I don't know whether the 88s would not reach us at that range or whether there were other closer targets. So we were sort of spectators from my ship watching a war, as I said, it's a strange, in retrospect, I don't think there was as much fear as much as there was wonderment and excitement about what we were watching. Well, I think military service, I think, was very useful and valuable to me later on, having positions of responsibility and executive or managerial authority. I think, indeed, I wouldn't be adverse to saying I think some mandatory service for youth would be a good idea. At one time, that was talked about. Of course, during World War II, it was required. But I think, and even in peacetime, I would recommend it.